Let's rewind exactly a century. The year is 1920, and we're looking at a fascinating, almost surreal moment where cutting-edge modern technology literally collides with ancient, deep-rooted tribal structures. What we're diving into today is a geopolitical puzzle, a story about lines drawn in the sand and the massive aftershocks that are absolutely still vibrating through our world today. Picture this. You're looking down from a Royal Air Force biplane during the golden hour in 1920. But below you, bombs are falling on rural farming villages. The British had just won World War I. They inherited this massive territory called Mesopotamia, and they were immediately faced with a staggering problem. Seriously, how do you build a brand new nation from scratch out of the ruins of an entire empire? Well, they decided to do it from the sky down. It turns out, early British imperial confidence evaporated pretty quickly when they were met with a massive, bloody uprising. Instead of being welcomed as liberators after ousting the Ottoman Turks, they faced fierce pushback. As the influential British official Gertrude Bell bluntly noted in 1920, they had totally underestimated that the country was, in her words, an inchoate mass of tribes. They tried to govern, and they failed. To put the scale of that failure into perspective, the human cost was staggering. We're talking about roughly 6,500 lives lost in the 1920 revolt before it was violently crushed. So, right out of the gate, this wasn't some peaceful, bureaucratic handover. It was a devastating conflict born out of a profound misunderstanding of the people who actually lived there. So, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with forging through fire, then meet the architect of Iraq, look at balancing the three pillars, examine the hammer of air control, discuss the Hashemite solution, and finally wrap up with a century of aftershocks. Starting with Section 1, forging through fire. Let's look at the complex international framework that even allowed the British to take control in the first place. You've probably heard of the Mandate system, but what was it really? Think of it as geopolitical babysitting, but with some pretty serious ulterior motives. The newly formed League of Nations basically gave Britain a trusteeship over Iraq. Now, the official on-paper goal was to guide the territory to independence, but in reality, it gave Britain the power to draw borders, control access to the Persian Gulf, and secure highly coveted oil fields, all without having to outright declare themselves a traditional colonizer. Moving to Section 2, the architect of Iraq. Because to really understand how those borders got drawn, we have to look at one specific woman standing among all the British diplomats at the 1921 Cairo Conference. Gertrude Bell was definitely not your traditional politician. We're talking about a pioneering archaeologist, a linguist, and an intelligence officer who essentially served as the Oriental Secretary. She possessed this unparalleled on-the-ground knowledge of the desert tribes. She shifted seamlessly from translating ancient history to actively drafting the blueprints of a modern state. The British government leaned heavily on her because she actually knew the sheikhs and understood the local rivalries. Which brings us to Section 3, balancing the three pillars. Even with all of Bell's expertise, she faced a completely monumental task. Imagine the demographic realities she was working with as a wildly unstable three-legged stool. The British were essentially forcing together a rural and urban Shiite majority, a Sunni minority, and a northern Kurdish population that actively wanted self-determination all into one single unitary government. And by relying heavily on the Sunni minority to run the military and the civil service, they immediately hardwired severe tension into the system with the Shia majority and the Kurds. So we hit Section 4, the hammer of air control. Because think about it. When a stool is that top-heavy and unbalanced, how do you actually keep it standing? Well, you nail it to the floor using immense, unforgiving force. Enter a really chilling piece of military jargon, the inverted blockade. The British wanted to control Iraq on the cheap, right? They didn't want to leave tens of thousands of ground troops there. So the Royal Air Force conducted a geopolitical siege from the sky. If a tribe refused to submit, the British didn't just fight their warriors. They directly attacked the population's livelihood, bombing homes, killing livestock, and destroying water sources. The whole procedure was chillingly systematic. Step 1, drop a warning via leaflet. Step 2, aerial bombardment of homes, crops, and water. Step 3, wait for total tribal submission as starvation sets in. It directly exploded the Arab culture of collective responsibility. By using absolute terror and the deprivation of basic survival needs, they crushed rural independence. Brutal? Absolutely. But for London's balance sheet, it was highly effective. On to Section 5, the Hashemite solution. Because pure military terror isn't a viable government on its own.
Bell and her colleagues orchestrated the installation of a new monarch.
And this is where we see the profound, almost baffling paradox of Gertrude Bell. On one hand, she genuinely championed Arab culture. She hosted these lavish tea parties and used deep personal diplomacy with Arab elites. But on the exact same token, she engineered a government that subordinated the Iraqi Shiite majority under King Faisal, who was a Sunni leader from Mecca, and she fully endorsed those same brutal RAF bombings to suppress the tribes she claimed to admire the second they resisted British rule. Finally, Section 6, a century of aftershocks. The crucial takeaway here is that this forced architecture didn't just solve a 1920s imperial headache. It set a highly volatile foundation for the next 100 years. The progression is super clear when you look at the timeline. The British install Faisal in 1921. Formal independence happens in 1932, sure, but those structural flaws, they were baked in. By locking disparate groups together using external air power, the Mandate created a pressure cooker. Once that external force lifted, the system fractured. The monarchy was violently overthrown in 1958, and fast forward to the 2003 U.S. invasion, those exact same fault lines erupted all over again into devastating sectarian conflict. So the next time you're reading today's headlines about the Middle East, take a second to look back at these origins. You kind of have to ask yourself, how much of today's conflict was literally drafted on a map by imperial architects way back in 1921? When you mix good intentions with imperial arrogance and brutal enforcement, those echoes don't just fade, they last for generations. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope it gave you some valuable perspective.